You should smile more, Grandma. Tonight is about the future, not the past. My granddaughter Sophie whispered as she adjusted the diamond bracelet on her wrist and walked past me like I was part of the hotel furniture. I said nothing. I simply looked down at the place card sitting in front of my dinner plate at the Columbus Grand Regency Ballroom in Ohio. It read, Grandma Evelyn, family guest. No mention of founder. No mention of owner. No mention of the woman who had spent 43 years building Carter and Hale furniture from a dusty two-car garage into one of the largest custom furniture companies in the Midwest. Around me, crystal chandeliers glowed against polished marble walls while waiters carried silver trays filled with filet mignon and glasses of sparkling champagne. The room smelled faintly of roses and expensive perfume. Everyone looked beautiful that night. My son Daniel wore a tailored navy tuxedo that probably cost more than my first mortgage payment back in 1979. Sophie stood beside him in a sleek white gown, greeting investors and local reporters with the confidence of someone who already believed the company belonged to her. Above the ballroom stage hung a giant illuminated sign that read, Carter and Hale, the future begins. I stared at those words longer than I should have, because once upon a time, that future had started with me. Mrs. Carter, one of the younger waitresses asked softly, would you like me to move your chair closer to the family table? I glanced toward the center of the ballroom. Sophie's table sat directly beneath the stage lights beside the company executives and shareholders. My table was near the back, beside two distant cousins and a retired supplier from Cincinnati. No, thank you, I told her with a polite smile. This seat is just fine. The truth was, I had already understood what tonight was really about long before dessert was served. It wasn't a celebration. It was a replacement ceremony. The older guests spoke quietly among themselves while Sophie moved through the ballroom, shaking hands like a politician preparing for office. Every few minutes, I heard someone say her name followed by words like visionary, modern, fresh leadership. Not one person mentioned Harold. My late husband's portrait sat near the ballroom entrance beside a display of company milestones. But even there, my own face had been cropped out of several old photographs. I noticed because I had lived those memories. I remembered standing beside Harold during our very first trade show in Cleveland when we couldn't even afford matching business cards. I remembered eating cold sandwiches in the warehouse while balancing invoices on my lap because we couldn't afford office staff yet. I remembered wrapping Christmas presents for employees by hand because Harold believed people stayed loyal when they felt appreciated. Those years had built this company, not Sophie's social media campaigns, not her polished interviews, not her expensive branding consultants from Chicago, but none of that seemed to matter anymore. Ladies and gentlemen, Sophie announced suddenly as she stepped onto the stage holding a champagne glass. Tonight marks the beginning of a bold new chapter for Carter and Hale. Applause filled the ballroom instantly. Daniel clapped first. Of course he did. I watched my own son look at her with admiration I hadn't seen in his eyes for years. Sophie smiled toward the crowd before her gaze landed on me for half a second. The future belongs to those willing to move forward, she continued smoothly. Not those trapped in old traditions. A few people laughed softly. Not loudly. Just enough. Just enough for me to hear it from the back table. I lowered my eyes to my untouched glass of water and folded my hands calmly in my lap. Across the ballroom, near the elevated stage platform, sat a large black leather chair reserved for the company owner during executive meetings and annual events. Tonight it remained empty beneath the golden lights. Sophie looked at that chair often while she spoke. So did I. The applause continued long after Sophie stepped away from the microphone. People stood near their tables smiling into wine glasses while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers in the ballroom ceiling. I remained seated quietly at the back of the room, watching servers carry slices of chocolate cake on a silver trays. Nobody approached my table anymore. 20 years ago, people used to cross crowded rooms just to shake my hand. Back then they called me Mrs. Carter with admiration in their voices. That night, I was simply Grandma Evelyn, tucked into the corner like an old family photo nobody wanted to throw away, but nobody wanted displayed either. I picked up my fork but did not touch the cake. Across the ballroom, Sophie laughed loudly beside a group of investors from Indianapolis. Every now and then she rested her hand on Daniel's arm while introducing him to someone important. He looked proud standing beside her. Tired too. Older than his 50 years. There was a time when Daniel used to walk through our factory holding my hand because the sanding machines frightened him. Harold would lift him onto unfinished dining tables and joke that one day the company would belong to him if he learned how to respect the people who built it. Respect. I thought about that word often lately. The ballroom lights reflected softly against the polished hardwood dance floor, and for a moment the smell of fresh wood polish pulled me backward through time. I remembered our first workshop outside Dayton in the winter of 1978. The heating system barely worked. Harold and I wore thick coats indoors while we assembled dining chairs ourselves because we could not afford extra staff yet. My hands used to crack and bleed from handling rough lumber all day. At night, I balanced invoices at the kitchen table while Daniel slept upstairs in our tiny two-bedroom house. Harold always said the company survived because I never let fear make decisions for us. When the bank rejected our second expansion loan, I mortgaged my mother's wedding jewelry without telling anyone. When our largest client canceled a contract in 1986, I drove through 3 states meeting showroom owners myself until we found replacement buyers. Every piece of Carter and Hale carried our fingerprints long before it carried our logo. But memories become inconvenient once younger people decide history slows them down. A waiter refilled my water glass carefully. "You doing okay tonight, Mrs. Carter?" he asked quietly. I recognized him after a second. Benji Morales. His father used to work in our Cincinnati warehouse before retiring last spring. "I am fine," I told him gently. "Thank you for asking." He hesitated before lowering his voice even further. "My dad still says this company would not exist without you." I smiled politely, though something inside my chest tightened. "Your father was one of the good ones," I said. Benji nodded once before hurrying away toward another table. Small moments like that had become rare. Most younger employees only knew the polished version of the company Sophie presented online. To them, Carter and Hale had appeared fully formed beside professional marketing campaigns and luxury showroom launches. They never saw Harold eating canned soup at midnight while reviewing payroll because employees had to be paid before we paid ourselves. They never saw me driving through snowstorms to deliver replacement furniture after shipping delays. They only saw the final success story. And lately, even that story no longer included me. Near the ballroom entrance, I noticed several framed company photographs displayed beside floral arrangements. My eyes settled on one black and white picture from 1992. Harold stood in the center cutting the ribbon at our first Columbus showroom opening. Daniel stood beside him smiling proudly in an oversized suit jacket. The place where I should have been standing had been cropped out entirely. I stared at the photograph for several seconds before quietly setting down my napkin. That was when I finally understood this was not accidental. Nobody accidentally erases a person from history piece by piece. Somebody chooses it. Somebody approves it. Somebody benefits from it. On stage, Sophie clinked her champagne glass again to regain everyone's attention. "Before tonight ends," she announced brightly, "I want to thank the people bold enough to move this company into a modern era." More applause followed. She turned slightly toward the executive table near the stage. "The future belongs to people willing to let go of outdated ways of thinking." Several guests nodded. Approvingly, Daniel smiled beside her again, though this time his eyes drifted briefly across the ballroom until they landed on me. He looked away almost immediately. I folded my hands calmly in my lap and lifted my eyes toward the large black leather owner's chair positioned beneath the stage lights. Empty. Waiting. Sophie glanced at it constantly while she spoke, as though she already imagined herself sitting there. The gala finally ended close to 11 that night. Guests drifted slowly toward the valet entrance wrapped in cashmere coats, while soft rain tapped against the tall hotel windows overlooking downtown Columbus. I stayed seated until almost everyone had left because I no longer had any reason to hurry home. The ballroom looked different once the crowd disappeared. Empty champagne glasses covered the tables. Half-melted candles flickered beside crushed linen napkins. Without the music and laughter, the room suddenly felt colder than before. Sophie stood near the stage speaking quietly with 2 board members while hotel staff dismantled floral arrangements behind them. Even from across the room, I could see the excitement glowing on her face. She looked like someone standing inches away from a life she had already decided belonged to her. Daniel approached my table slowly after checking his phone for the 3rd time in 5 minutes. "You leaving already, Mom?" he asked casually. I looked up at him. "It is late," I answered. People my age usually sleep before midnight. He forced a small laugh, but it disappeared quickly. Up close, the lines around his eyes looked deeper than I remembered. Tonight went well, he said carefully. The investors seemed excited. I nodded once. Yes. Sophie made sure everyone understood that. He shifted awkwardly beside my chair. She is trying to help the company evolve. Evolve. That word again. Over the last 3 years, every painful change inside Carter and Hale had arrived, disguised as progress. First came the showroom redesigns. Then the new logo. Then the layoffs. Harold's old office became a modern glass conference room where nobody even kept family photos anymore. Sophie called it simplifying the brand identity. I called it erasing the people who built it. Do you remember the old warehouse in Dayton? I asked quietly. Daniel blinked in surprise. What? The first one. The one with the leaking roof. He gave a faint smile. Barely. You were 8 years old. I continued softly. A thunderstorm flooded half the building one spring night. Your father stayed there until 4 in the morning moving inventory by hand, because we could not afford to lose a single shipment. Daniel looked down at the ballroom carpet. I remember some of it. You cried because you thought the company would close. His expression tightened slightly. Mom, your father sat you on top of a shipping crate and told you something important that night. Daniel rubbed the back of his neck uncomfortably. I do not remember exactly. He said businesses survive because people protect each other, not because they chase applause. Silence settled between us. Nearby, hotel workers folded tablecloths with quiet efficiency while the stage lights dimmed one row at a time. Daniel finally sighed. Things are different now. I looked towards Sophie again. She was laughing with the board members while pointing at architectural renderings spread across the executive table. Yes, I said calmly. I can see that. He followed my gaze toward the stage before lowering his voice. Sophie has big plans for the company. Expansion into Chicago. New investors. New branding partnerships. The board likes her ideas. Does the board know where the company started? I asked. Does anybody remember? Daniel looked tired suddenly. Not angry, just tired. Mom, people care about results. I studied my son carefully. There was a time when Daniel used to sit beside Harold during meetings taking notes like every conversation mattered. After Harold passed away 2 years earlier, something inside him changed slowly. Grief hollowed him out first. Then Sophie filled the empty spaces with ambition. I had watched it happen piece by piece while pretending not to notice. You should head home, Daniel said gently after checking his watch again. The weather is getting worse. I rose carefully from my chair and reached for my coat. Across the ballroom, Sophie finally noticed us standing together. She excused herself from the investors and walked toward us confidently in silver heels that clicked sharply against the marble floor. Grandma Evelyn, she said brightly, I hope tonight was not too overwhelming for you. Her smile looked polished enough for magazine covers. Everything changes so fast in this industry now. I slipped my coat over my shoulders slowly. Some things should not change quite so easily, I replied. Her smile barely moved. Well, the future belongs to people willing to adapt. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Sophie glanced toward the large black leather owner's chair still sitting beneath the dim ballroom lights. Honestly, she said softly enough that only Daniel and I could hear. It is probably time that chair finally belongs to someone who understands where the world is headed. I followed her eyes toward the empty chair. Then I looked back at her calm, confident face. And for the first time that night, I noticed she had absolutely no idea whose name was still attached to the company. Rain followed me all the way home from Columbus that night. The windshield wipers moved back and forth in slow rhythm, while downtown lights blurred against the wet highway outside my car windows. I drove the same black Lincoln Harold bought me for our 40th wedding anniversary, though Sophie once suggested during a family dinner that it looked outdated beside the newer executive vehicles. I remembered smiling politely while she explained how appearances mattered in business now. Everything mattered to Sophie except loyalty. My house sat 30 minutes outside the city near a quiet stretch of maple trees that Harold planted himself almost 20 years ago. The porch light still turned on automatically every evening at sunset because Harold believed nobody should ever come home to darkness. I stood inside the kitchen for a long moment after hanging up my coat. The house felt exactly the same as it had the morning Harold left for the hospital 2 years earlier. His coffee mug still rested inside the cabinet beside mine. His reading glasses still sat folded neatly on the small table near the living room window. Some people call that unhealthy. I call it love refusing to disappear on schedule. I poured myself tea and walked slowly toward Harold's old study. Sophie hated this room. She once called it cluttered and emotionally outdated during a conversation she thought I could not hear. But Harold's study was the heart of our company long before there were executive offices and boardrooms. The shelves still held handwritten ledgers from the 1980s. Framed newspaper articles from our first regional expansion lined the walls beside old photographs of factory crews standing proudly beside completed furniture collections. There was even a picture of Harold and me covered in sawdust during the opening week of our Dayton workshop. We looked exhausted and happy. I lowered myself carefully into Harold's leather chair and opened the bottom drawer of his mahogany desk. Inside rested dozens of neatly organized folders tied with colored tabs. Harold believed important things should always remain orderly. Tax records, property deeds, original partnership agreements, insurance contracts. Every major decision from 40 years of business life sat inside that desk protected more carefully than jewelry. My fingers paused over one folder labeled Corporate Structure, Final Revision. I stared at it for several seconds before pulling it free. Harold updated the company structure only 6 months before he passed away. At the time, he told me not to worry about the details because everything had already been arranged properly. I trusted him completely. Maybe too completely. Outside, rain tapped steadily against the windows while I opened the folder across the desk beneath the warm yellow reading lamp. Most of the pages contained familiar legal language I had already seen before. Ownership percentages, board authority, voting rights, executive limitations. But halfway through the documents, a small handwritten note slipped loose from between 2 pages and landed softly against the desk surface. The handwriting belonged to Harold, immediately recognizable even after all this time. Evelyn, if you are reading this someday, it means people have started showing you who they truly are. I stopped breathing for a moment. Slowly, I lowered myself deeper into the chair and continued reading. You always believed kindness could hold this family together. I wanted to believe that too. But business changes people once money and power begin speaking louder than gratitude. That is why I made certain protections remain in place even after I am gone. My chest tightened painfully. Harold knew. Somehow, before he died, he had already seen pieces of this coming. I turned toward the next page carefully. Attached behind the note sat a sealed legal memorandum stamped with the company attorney's signature from Cleveland. My eyes moved across several highlighted sections while thunder rumbled softly outside the house. Then I saw it. Sole controlling voting authority remains permanently assigned to Evelyn Carter under Clause 7 unless voluntarily surrendered by signed written transfer. I read the sentence twice. Then a third time. My fingers trembled slightly against the paper. 51% ownership control. Final executive authority over board restructuring. Permanent approval rights regarding company succession. Harold had never removed me from the center of Carter and Hale. Not legally. Not financially. Not structurally. All this time Sophie had been walking through those boardrooms believing the company already belonged to her future. Meanwhile, the final decision still rested quietly inside a locked desk drawer in my home. I leaned back slowly in Harold's chair while the rain continued falling outside. The silence inside the study felt different now. Not empty anymore. Clear. Focused. Across the room, Harold's framed photograph rested beside the bookshelf, his familiar smile frozen forever beneath soft lamplight. You saw this coming, I whispered quietly. The house remained silent around me. But for the first time in months, I no longer felt invisible. The next morning, Ohio sunlight filtered softly through the kitchen windows as if the storm from the night before had never happened. I woke earlier than usual, long before the rest of the neighborhood stirred awake. The house carried that quiet stillness that only exists just before sunrise. For years I used to love mornings like that, because Harold always rose before me. I could still picture him standing beside the stove in his old gray robe, reading the newspaper while coffee brewed in the background. Even now, 2 years after his passing, some part of me still expected to hear his footsteps moving through the hallway. I carried my coffee into the study again and placed the mug carefully beside the stack of documents spread across the desk. The legal memorandum remained exactly where I left it the night before. Calm, clear, Permanent. Harold had protected me without ever announcing it. That was the kind of man he was. He never believed real power needed attention. I read every page again slowly. Corporate succession restrictions, board limitations, voting control clauses. Harold had structured everything so carefully that no executive transition could happen without my direct approval. Not Daniel's, not Sophie's, mine, which meant all the speeches about the future and leadership had been little more than theater. Sophie had been acting like the next owner while standing on a stage she did not legally control. Oddly enough, the realization did not make me angry anymore. It made me sad, because underneath all her polished confidence, Sophie had revealed something far uglier than ambition. She truly believed older people became irrelevant once younger voices grew louder. Around 10 that morning, I drove downtown to the original Carter and Hale administrative building near the riverfront. The newer corporate headquarters stood 20 minutes away in a glass tower Sophie preferred because she said it looked more modern for investors. But the old administrative office still handled archived legal files and financial records. Harold refused to move those departments before he passed away. Real history belongs on solid ground, he used to say. The receptionist looked startled when I entered the building. Mrs. Carter, she said quickly while standing up from her desk. I did not know you were coming in today. Neither did I answered gently. The hallway smelled faintly of printer ink and old carpet. Some things inside that building had not changed in decades. Framed employee photographs still lined the walls beside retirement plaques and newspaper clippings from our earliest years. Unlike the gala ballroom, nobody had cropped me out of these memories yet. As I walked toward the records office, several older employees greeted me warmly. A few younger staff members looked confused, as though they recognized my face, but could not quite place why. That hurt more than I expected. Inside the records department, I found Arthur Bennett reviewing invoices beside a stack of shipping manifests. Arthur had worked for Harold since 1982. His white hair had thinned considerably over the years, but his posture remained sharp as ever. When he saw me standing in the doorway, he immediately removed his glasses. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "it has been too long." I smiled softly. "You still organize paperwork better than anyone in this company." Arthur gave a tired chuckle before studying my expression more carefully. "Something is wrong," he said. It was not a question. I stepped inside and closed the office door behind me. "I need to review the final succession filings Harold submitted before he died." Arthur became very still. For several seconds he said nothing at all. Then he slowly opened the bottom drawer of his filing cabinet and removed a thick sealed envelope stamped Confidential Corporate Authority. "I wondered how long it would take before you came asking," he admitted quietly. "Harold prepared these himself." My fingers tightened slightly around the envelope. "Did he know?" Arthur sighed heavily before leaning back in his chair. Harold noticed changes after Sophie entered the company. Board members stopped consulting senior staff. Financial meetings became secretive. Expansion proposals moved too fast. He paused carefully. He was especially worried about Daniel. Hearing my son's name spoken that way felt like swallowing ice water. "Daniel loved this company once," I whispered. "He still does," Arthur replied gently. "But grief changes people, and Sophie understands how to influence weakness." Silence settled heavily between us. Outside the office window, forklifts moved shipments across the loading dock exactly the way they had for decades. Business continued. It always did. Arthur folded his hands carefully on top of the desk. "Evelyn," he said quietly, "there is something else you need to understand." I looked up at him. His expression had grown more serious than before. "Sophie has already scheduled a special board meeting 3 weeks from now." My stomach tightened immediately. "For what purpose?" Arthur held my gaze steadily. "Official succession restructuring." He hesitated before adding the final sentence softly. "She believes the owner's chair will become hers that night." For the next 2 weeks, I said nothing to anyone about the documents Harold left behind. I attended meetings when invited. I answered phone calls politely. I smiled during lunches with board members who suddenly seemed far more interested in Sophie's opinions than my own. It amazed me how quickly people rewrite loyalty once they believe power has shifted permanently. Every morning, I drove past the new glass headquarters on my way into the older administrative building near the riverfront. The newer office looked impressive from the outside. Bright white walls, massive windows, expensive landscaping. Sophie loved modern spaces because she believed polished appearances created authority. Harold always believed authority came from consistency. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, I stopped by the executive floor at the newer headquarters to drop off signed payroll approvals. The receptionist barely looked up from her computer before speaking. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked automatically. I stared at her for a moment, not offended exactly, just surprised. "No," I answered calmly. "I suppose 43 years no longer qualifies as advance notice." Her face turned bright red almost immediately. "Mrs. Carter, I am so sorry. I did not realize. It is perfectly all right," I interrupted gently. "Most people here probably do not." The executive floor smelled faintly of fresh paint and expensive coffee. Sleek furniture replaced the old oak desks Harold preferred. Even the walls looked colder somehow. As I walked past the conference rooms, I noticed framed company photographs had been replaced with abstract artwork and oversized branding slogans. Innovation defines legacy. Disrupt the expected. Move forward or be left behind. Sophie's fingerprints were everywhere now. I reached the main boardroom just as voices drifted through the partially open door. "The older generation built a strong foundation," Sophie was saying smoothly. "But emotional attachment cannot drive business decisions forever." Several people murmured in agreement. I remained still outside the doorway without making a sound. "Investors want confidence," Sophie continued. "They want leadership that understands where the market is heading, not nostalgia." Someone chuckled softly. Another voice asked, "Do you think Evelyn will resist the restructuring?" Sophie laughed lightly before answering. "Honestly, I think she is tired. She still sees this company like a family scrapbook." More quiet laughter followed. "And Daniel?" another board member asked. Sophie paused briefly before replying in a softer tone. "Daniel knows change is necessary. He just struggles with guilt sometimes." Guilt. Hearing my son described that way inside his father's company hurt far more than the insults aimed at me. I quietly stepped away from the doorway before anyone noticed I had been standing there. Some wounds arrive loudly. Others settle slowly into your chest like winter cold. I took the elevator down alone and drove home through steady afternoon rain while those conversations replayed endlessly in my mind. That evening, Daniel called unexpectedly around 7. "Mom," he said carefully, "you missed the strategy meeting today." I folded laundry slowly while balancing the phone against my shoulder. I was not aware my attendance mattered anymore. Silence filled the line briefly. "That is not fair." "No," I answered quietly. "It is not." I heard him exhale heavily. "Sophie is under pressure right now. The board expects growth." "And what do you expect?" I asked. Another silence. Longer this time. "I just want the company to survive." I walked toward the living room window and looked out at the darkening maple trees Harold planted years ago. "Your father never feared competition," I said. Softly. "He feared becoming the kind of people we use to protect ourselves from." Daniel sounded exhausted suddenly. "Mom, why does everything have to become personal with you?" The question settled into me deeper than he realized. Because for Harold and me, Carter and Hale was personal. It was birthdays missed because shipments ran late. It was mortgage payments delayed so employees could receive Christmas bonuses. It was 20-hour workdays and $20 bank accounts and promises whispered across kitchen tables at 2 in the morning. Companies built by sacrifice do not stop being personal simply because younger people inherit the profits. "Good night, Daniel," I said gently before he could continue. I hung up the phone and stood quietly in the dark living room for several moments. Then I walked into Harold's study again and opened the sealed envelope Arthur Bennett had given me earlier that week. Inside sat the official board agenda for the upcoming succession meeting. My eyes moved carefully across the printed pages until they reached the final line near the bottom. Formal transfer of executive authority and owner chair appointment. Scheduled 3 weeks from now. 7 o'clock sharp. Sophie had already planned her victory celebration. She just did not understand yet that the chair she wanted so badly had never been hers to claim. The morning of the board meeting arrived cold and gray, the kind of Ohio evening where the clouds hang low enough to make the entire city feel heavier. I woke before dawn even though the meeting was not scheduled until 7 that night. Sleep had become shallow lately, not because I was afraid, but because clarity changes the way a person rests. Once you finally understand the truth about people, your mind stops searching for explanations. It simply observes. I stood quietly in front of my bedroom mirror while fastening a pair of pearl earrings Harold bought me during our 20th anniversary trip to Charleston. I had not worn them in years. My silver hair framed a face older than the woman who once balanced payroll ledgers at midnight beside a sleeping child, but my eyes looked steadier now. Calm has a different shape once. Fear disappears. Downstairs, I made coffee and carried the mug into Harold's study one final time before leaving for the meeting. His photograph still rested beside the bookshelf exactly where it always had. "You should be here tonight," I whispered softly. The room remained silent except for the ticking grandfather clock near the hallway. I gathered the documents carefully into a dark leather folder before placing it inside my bag. Ownership filings. Succession restrictions. The handwritten note Harold left behind. Every page carried more weight than Sophie realized. By late afternoon, downtown Columbus shimmered beneath wet streets and glowing office windows. Traffic crawled slowly through the business district while black sedans lined the curb outside the Carter and Hale headquarters. Tonight was supposed to mark the beginning of a new era for the company. At least that was how Sophie described it in the invitation sent to investors and board members earlier that week. Leadership Transition Celebration. I almost smiled when I first read those words. The lobby buzzed with quiet conversation when I entered the building shortly before 7. Men in tailored suits stood near the elevators discussing expansion forecasts while assistants carried folders and presentation tablets toward the executive floor. Several people looked surprised to see me arrive. Others offered polite smiles filled with uncertainty. Nobody quite knew what role I still played anymore. That confusion suited me perfectly. Arthur Bennett met me near the private elevator reserved for board members. "Everything is ready," he said quietly. His voice sounded tense beneath its calm surface. I nodded once. "How nervous is she?" Arthur adjusted his glasses carefully, confident enough to stop being careful. We rode the elevator upward in silence. When the doors finally opened onto the executive floor, I immediately heard Sophie's voice drifting through the boardroom. Bright, smooth, certain. "Tonight is about momentum," she was saying confidently. "We cannot build a future while staying emotionally tied to the past." Several board members murmured in agreement. Arthur and I walked slowly toward the partially open boardroom doors. Inside, the long walnut conference table gleamed beneath soft recessed lighting. Crystal water glasses sat beside leather folders embossed with the Carter and Hale logo. At the far end of the room sat the large black owner's chair positioned slightly higher than the others. And sitting inside it already was Sophie. Her white suit looked perfectly tailored. Her blonde hair fell neatly across one shoulder while she reviewed printed notes beside Daniel. She looked comfortable in that chair, like someone rehearsing a life she had imagined for a long time. Daniel noticed me first. His expression shifted immediately from distraction to visible discomfort. Sophie turned seconds later and smiled brightly when she saw me standing near the doorway. "Grandma Evelyn," she said warmly enough for everyone in the room to hear. "I am so glad you came tonight." I stepped inside slowly while conversations around the table faded into silence. "I received the invitation," I answered calmly. Sophie rose gracefully from the owner's chair and walked toward me in silver heels that clicked softly against the hardwood floor. "Tonight means a great deal to all of us," she continued smoothly, "especially because we are honoring the company legacy while preparing for the future." Her performance was flawless. If someone did not know her better, they might have mistaken ambition for sincerity. I glanced briefly toward the owner's chair behind her. "You seem very comfortable sitting there already," I said quietly. A few board members shifted awkwardly in their seats. Sophie laughed lightly as though the comment amused her. "Well," she replied confidently, "sometimes leadership requires people willing to step forward." I held her gaze calmly for several seconds. Then I noticed the leather folder resting beside her seat. Gold letters stamped across the front read "Executive Succession Final Approval." Sophie followed my eyes and smiled again. "Everything is prepared," she said softly. "By the end of tonight, the company can finally move ahead without uncertainty." Daniel lowered his eyes toward the conference table without saying a word. Arthur Bennett remained silent beside the doorway. The room itself felt strangely still, as though even the air understood something important was about to happen. Slowly, I removed Harold's leather folder from my bag and placed it carefully against the polished conference table. Sophie noticed the movement immediately, but her confident smile never disappeared. Not yet. The boardroom remained silent after I placed Harold's leather folder on the table. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, rain streaked slowly across the Columbus skyline, while headlights moved below like distant rivers of light. Nobody spoke for several seconds. Sophie still stood beside the owner's chair with one hand resting lightly against the polished wood, her confident smile perfectly controlled. But I noticed something small shift in her expression when Arthur Bennett quietly walked toward the head of the table carrying a sealed legal envelope. Before tonight's succession vote begins, Arthur announced carefully, there are additional corporate documents that require formal review. Several board members exchanged confused glances. Sophie straightened slightly. Arthur, we already finalized the transition paperwork last week. Not all of it, he replied calmly. Daniel looked up immediately. What documents? Arthur placed the sealed envelope directly in front of me before answering. Mr. Harold Carter submitted amended succession protections 6 months before his passing. They were placed under delayed disclosure authorization. Sophie frowned for the first time all evening. Delayed disclosure? She repeated carefully. Arthur nodded once. The instructions required release only if executive authority restructuring was attempted without Mrs. Evelyn Carter's approval. The room became very still after that sentence. I slowly opened the envelope and removed the original legal memorandum Harold signed before 2 witnesses and the company attorney from Cleveland. My hands remained steady despite the weight of every eye fixed on me. Daniel leaned forward slightly in his chair. Mom, what is this? I looked at my son quietly before sliding the first document across the table toward him. Your father believed in. Preparing for possibilities other people ignored. Sophie gave a short, uneasy laugh. I do not understand why this matters tonight. The board already approved the succession framework. Arthur adjusted his glasses carefully. The board approved a proposal based on incomplete authority disclosures. One of the investors near the far end of the table cleared his throat nervously. Arthur, are you saying the succession vote is invalid? Arthur folded his hands in front of him. I am saying Mrs. Evelyn Carter retains sole controlling voting authority under Clause 7 of the corporate ownership structure. Silence crashed over the room so suddenly it almost felt physical. Daniel stared down at the paperwork in front of him while the color slowly drained from his face. Sophie remained standing beside the owner's chair, completely motionless now. That is impossible, she said quietly. Harold transferred operational control years ago. Operational, Arthur corrected calmly. Not ownership. Sophie looked directly at me then for the first time without confidence protecting her expression. You knew about this? I held her gaze steadily. Not until recently. One of the board members quickly flipped through the legal documents with visible panic growing across his face. 51% controlling authority, he muttered under his breath. Another director leaned toward Daniel. Did you know any of this? Daniel shook his head slowly without speaking. Sophie finally stepped away from the owner's chair. This changes nothing about the company's future, she insisted quickly. The investors still support the restructuring. Arthur calmly removed another document from the envelope. There is more. Nobody moved. Nobody even reached for their water glasses anymore. Arthur placed the final page carefully at the center of the conference table. Mr. Carter also included inheritance protection clauses tied directly to executive conduct. Sophie's expression tightened immediately. What does that mean? Arthur looked directly at her before answering. Any executive or family member found attempting to manipulate succession authority through deliberate exclusion, coercion, or reputational removal of Mrs. Evelyn Carter forfeits future inheritance eligibility connected to the Carter family trust. Daniel's chair scraped softly against the hardwood floor as he sat back heavily. Jesus, he whispered under his breath. Sophie stared at the documents in complete silence now. The confidence that filled the room earlier had disappeared so quickly it almost felt unreal. Nobody looked at her the same way anymore. Not the investors. Not the board. Not even Daniel. I watched her carefully as realization settled across her face piece by piece. Every cropped photograph. Every humiliating introduction. Every conversation about pushing the older generation aside. Harold had seen the pattern long before any of us admitted it existed. You planned this, Sophie said softly toward me. I shook my head once. No, your behavior planned it. The room remained silent except for the distant sound of rain tapping against the windows. Slowly, I rose from my chair and walked toward the head of the conference table. Sophie stepped aside automatically this time, without anyone asking her to move. I paused beside the large black owner's chair and rested my fingers lightly against the leather. For weeks, Sophie had stared at this chair like it represented victory. But Harold always understood something she never did. Ownership was never about sitting above people. It was about protecting what other people built together. Calmly, I lowered myself into the chair while the entire boardroom watched in silence. Nobody spoke for several long seconds after I sat down in the owner's chair. The rain outside continued sliding slowly down the dark glass windows while the city lights shimmered beneath the storm like blurred reflections. Around the conference table, board members avoided eye contact with one another. Papers remained spread across polished wood surfaces beside untouched water glasses and half-open folders. Just an hour earlier, this room had been prepared for celebration. Now it felt like a courtroom after the verdict had already been delivered. Sophie remained standing beside the chair she had imagined belonging to her. The confidence that once sharpened every movement had disappeared completely. She looked smaller somehow. Younger. Not powerful anymore. Just startled. Daniel still stared down at the succession documents in front of him as though rereading them might somehow change the outcome. Finally, one of the senior investors cleared his throat carefully. "Mrs. Carter," he said quietly, "what would you like to do moving forward?" I folded my hands calmly on the conference table. "First," I answered softly, "I would like everyone in this room to remember something very simple." Every eye lifted toward me again. This company was never built by one person chasing power. It survived because people trusted each other enough to sacrifice together. Silence followed my words gently this time instead of sharply. I looked toward the board members seated around the table. Some had worked beside Harold and me for decades. Others had arrived recently during Sophie's expansion campaigns. But all of them looked uncomfortable now because deep down they understood exactly when things inside Carter and Hale had started changing. "I am not interested in humiliating anyone tonight," I continued calmly. "That is not how Harold led this company. And it is not how I intend to lead it either." Sophie lowered her eyes briefly. Daniel finally looked toward me again. But there was something fragile in his expression now that I had not seen in years. "Shame. However," I said quietly, "certain decisions must still be corrected." Arthur Bennett slid several prepared documents across the conference table toward me. I signed them one by one with slow, steady movements. Temporary suspension of succession restructuring. Restoration of senior advisory review authority. Reinstatement of employee retention protections Harold originally established years earlier. Nothing dramatic. Just corrections. Sophie watched every signature carefully. "You are removing me," she said softly. I met her eyes calmly. "I am removing your authority to make decisions you never earned the right to make alone." Her face tightened slightly, though to her credit, she did not argue anymore. Perhaps because for the first time since entering this company, she finally understood the difference between influence and ownership. Daniel stood slowly from his chair. "Mom," he said quietly, "I should have stopped this earlier." I looked at my son for a long moment before answering. "Yes," I said gently. He lowered his head immediately. The pain on his face hurt me more than Sophie's ambition ever did. Because Daniel had once been kind. Grief had not turned him cruel. It had simply made him weak enough to stand beside cruelty without confronting it. There is a difference. Outside the boardroom windows, the rain had finally started easing into mist. Downtown lights glowed softly beneath the dark sky, while traffic moved quietly through the streets below. The city looked peaceful again. Arthur closed the final legal folder carefully before stepping back from the table. "The meeting is officially adjourned," he announced. Chairs shifted softly against the hardwood floor as board members gathered their belongings in awkward silence. Nobody celebrated anymore. Nobody congratulated Sophie. One by one, they quietly exited the room until only Daniel, Sophie, Arthur, and I remained beneath the dim, recessed lights. Sophie picked up her folder slowly without speaking. Before leaving, she paused near the doorway and finally turned toward me one last time. "I thought the company needed someone stronger," she admitted quietly. I studied her face carefully. "Strength without respect eventually becomes arrogance," I answered. She looked down for a second before leaving the room without another word. Daniel lingered behind after the door closed. "Can we fix this?" he asked softly. I glanced toward Harold's leather folder resting beside my hand. Then I looked back at my son. "That depends," I said calmly, "on whether you still remember who your father tried to raise." Daniel's eyes filled with regret he could no longer hide. But regret arrives late in most families. Sometimes too late. After he finally left, I remained alone in the boardroom for several quiet minutes. The owner's chair no longer felt powerful beneath me, just heavy. I rested one hand lightly against the worn leather armrest Harold once used during meetings years ago. Then I looked out, across the empty conference room, and understood something Sophie never had. The chair was never the reward. The people who trusted you enough to place you there were.